This is Carla Atherton, Director of the Healthy Family Formula and host and producer of the Children's Health Summit 4. In response to the rapid rise in conditions such as autism, cancer, ADHD, GI distress, anxiety, depression, asthma, skin conditions, learning disabilities, and autoimmunity, the topic of this year's summit is preventing and reversing childhood chronic illness. And today, I'm very excited to be interviewing this session's speaker, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. Dr. Stephanie Seneff is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA. She has a BA or BS degree from MIT in biology and a PhD from MIT in electrical engineering and computer science. Her recent interests have focused on the role of toxic chemicals and micronutrient deficiencies in health and disease, with a special emphasis on the pervasive herbicide Roundup and the mineral sulfur. She has authored over 30 peer-reviewed journal papers over the past few years on these topics. I'm so excited to be welcoming Stephanie Seneff. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the summit, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes. Okay. So I just have to say, I've listened to Dr. Seneff's YouTube videos, podcasts, writings. I've read her research. I actually I lead my own students to her work because we need to know all of the stuff that Dr. Seneff has been uncovering for us all, tirelessly, I must say. So really, this is an honor and a privilege to have her here and to educate us on these topics that she's been, like I said, tirelessly uncovering for us all. So especially important for our children, those kiddos who have all of those sort of conditions that I mentioned in the intro, because the topics that we'll be talking about today are at the very root, as part of the cause of what's really happening with our kids in their health these days. So Dr. Seneff, I'm going to try to keep calling you Dr. Seneff, but because I respect your work.
Yeah, you can call me Stephanie next time.
You're so wonderful, and I just want to talk to you like a friend. So anyway, my first question so to get you, the audience, oriented in your work and why you do what you do. So as I was saying in your intro, you've done a lot of research on the toxic environment and chemicals. And so what got you started doing that?
Yeah, well, I was looking, it's about 12 years ago when I was looking at the autism rates and getting worried because I was seeing exponential growth, and that I know gets really scary once the numbers get big. Mm-hmm. And I also saw that most of the research dollars were spent on genetics, and exponential growth is not a genetic problem. There may be a genetic predisposition that makes some kids more susceptible, but eventually everybody's going to get the problem if the toxic chemical keeps going up. So I was really, really interested in trying to figure out what it was that was causing this. And of course, I was seeing other diseases in children going up, and a lot of autoimmune issues, diabetes, various cancers, many things, sleep disorder were going up along with the autism. And I just thought there's something going on in our environment that we need to find, and we need to find it soon because we're going to be in very big trouble if this continues. Yeah. And frankly, I looked for 5 years without even thinking of Roundup. Roundup is, of course, what I settled in on, glyphosate. If people don't know, glyphosate is Roundup. Roundup, the active ingredient is glyphosate, and it's considered to be perfectly safe. And therefore, I just didn't even think about it as being a possible cause. So I was looking a lot at vaccines. I was looking at fluoride, and I was looking at the PCBs, all these different things that are in the environment. And I was coming up cold. I mean, not entirely cold. I felt the vaccines had a contributory, contribution, but they were not the whole story. I was seeing that autistic kids had a lot of issues with their gut. And so I was thinking maybe they're taking too many antibiotics, maybe they're getting a lot of ear infections, then is their immune system so weak? I was sort of not making it, not finding it, feeling frustrated actually. And it was really lucky. It just happened to be almost God's influence that I happened to be at a conference where this Don Huber happened to be speaking, a professor retired from Purdue University, expert in plants. He gave a 2-hour presentation at this conference on this thing called glyphosate, which I actually did not know what that was. Quite amazing for me to think about that now, because it's so much a part of my vocabulary.
Yes.
So he gave this 2-hour presentation. I was on the edge of my seat because it's like, oh my God, this is it. I mean, I really walked away feeling like I had found it. It was quite an epiphany. And I've never looked back. I mean, I basically sunk my teeth into glyphosate, ferociously read every paper I could find, and hooked up with Anthony Samsel, and he and I have had a very productive collaboration with 6 papers published so far together. And he's a really interesting person as well. He's a chemist and a toxicologist who's been doing a lot of interesting studies on glyphosate contamination in various places and finding all kinds of interesting, biological substances that contain glyphosate. So, so anyway, I really felt I had the answer, and then I went back and confirmed it, because the more I read, even to this day, I still find almost every day something new that confirms even more the connection between glyphosate and autism, and between all these other diseases that are going up dramatically. It's amazing. So I'm very excited about this chemical.
Wow. Yeah. So what exactly is it? How are we? So we're exposed to it through Roundup, like that. It's Roundup. So like give me the ways and how that people are exposed to it.
Right. So it's pretty much everywhere. First of all, the United States uses more per capita than any other country in the world. We really love the stuff. And we use it, people use it on their lawns. They make their lawns look beautiful. They kill the dandelions. So it's the exposure there. And they're using it on playgrounds in many cases. So the kids playing on the playgrounds are going to pick it up. It's in the tampons. So it's in cotton products. So you can think about it being in tampons or in Pampers, baby diapers, cotton clothing. So the kids are getting exposure on their skin through that. It's in the air, certainly if you live near a farm. So it's being sprayed on many of the foods. The GMO Roundup Ready crops are the most well known. And those are the core crops of the processed food industry. So you've got soy, corn, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa. Those are the core, and cotton is also GMO Roundup Ready. So those are the crops that are going to have chronic exposure, because you can just spray the crop and it won't die, but it soaks it up and gets it into its tissues, and it ends up in your food supply. So there's contaminations of glyphosate in many, many different foods. Interestingly, the highest contaminations are showing up not in the GMO crops, but in the non-GMO crops that are being sprayed right before harvest. And that's a practice that's becoming increasingly common, particularly wheat, oats, legumes. That's things like chickpeas and garbanzo beans. Are being sprayed right before the harvest as a desiccant. Sugarcane as well, so that means sugar. Sugar beets are GMO Roundup Ready, so you're getting it in your sugar. It's showing up in the oils, the vegetable oils like canola oil, but very high levels in the chickpeas, the oats, and the wheat, which I think is the reason. The wheat is the reason why we have an epidemic in celiac disease today. I believe that's a direct hit. So.
Wow.
And then it's probably also in the air if you're just driving on the highway, because the gasoline today is 10% ethanol, and ethanol is derived from GMO Roundup Ready corn. So it's possible that it's in the gasoline, and it won't get killed by burning. So when you burn your gas and the vapors are released in the fumes, you've probably got glyphosate in there. Now, I haven't tested that, but that would just be theoretical. But it would make sense to me that if you're on the highway, with the top down and convertible with a heavy traffic, you're probably breathing glyphosate.
Wow. And and actually that's a really interesting point, because I actually turn off my air. Like if we're in traffic, like if I'm driving on the highway, I know everything's kind of blowing back behind us. But if there's a tailpipe, in front of me in traffic, I always turn off any air that's coming into my car. It's automatic. I just go, and even if it's summer and we're kind of hot, or it's winter and we're kind of cold, I'll just still it's a few minutes until we get going again, but I never turn it on when I'm in traffic.
Right.
And it's only because of the other chemicals that I'm thinking that are in there. I never would have thought in a million years there's glyphosate in that gasoline, or the exhaust coming from the car.
So, I mean, it hasn't been proven, but it's an interesting thought, and there's not a good reason why it wouldn't be there, I think. So it needs to be looked at.
Oh yeah, I would love to see that. And so basically, I mean, it sounds a little scary. Okay, so, and we're gonna get to what we can do about this and toward the end, but so basically everybody is exposed to glyphosate, like whether or not you eat
Absolutely.
Or if you do what I do and turn off my, my air in my car and all that stuff, like everybody will be exposed. Is that correct?
I think so. I think it'd be very difficult to live in this country and not be exposed to glyphosate. Almost impossible. You have to be on I don't know where you'd have to be, because in this country, it's everywhere.
I mean, I'll build my bubble. I'm out in the country now.
I know.
The bubble will have to follow. Yes. Okay. So
Yeah.
you mentioned autism, Dr. Seneff, and you so you said that is actually a causal factor. So how does glyphosate lead to autism?
Yeah, now that's a very, very complicated question with a very
Yep.
complicated answer, but I'll try to give some pieces of it because I mean, every which way I look, it leads to autism. It's quite amazing. And autism is a very complex condition with many, many comorbidities. We're finding, people are doing a lot of studying now. Lately, some great studies have been coming out looking at the autistic gut, looking at the microbes and how they're imbalanced and different inflammatory conditions and issues with digestion like diarrhea and constipation. They have a lot of problems with their gut. And that's, I think, where glyphosate starts because you're eating it. And I think possibly the biggest factor is the food, which if that's true, it's good news because you can eat organic and cut your dosage down quite a bit. Not zero, but quite a bit lower if you choose to eat only organic foods. And that's certainly what I do. I always buy certified organic when I shop. And I want to emphasize that early on because that's very important, I think. And that's such a really easy thing to do when you think about it because today there's many organic foods. Almost every food you want, there's an organic choice you can find these days, except for maybe really obscure things. It's not hard to convert to organic. It'll cost you a little money, but you will get that money back in spades with all the illnesses that your family don't get. It's totally worth it. So that's a big message there. So they're getting it in their food. And then glyphosate has been patented as an antimicrobial agent, so it kills microbes. It works on the plants through the shikimate pathway. The shikimate pathway is a very important biological pathway in plants. And human cells don't have that pathway, which is why Monsanto claims it's an easy idea that, oh, great, we don't have that pathway, therefore we're immune to glyphosate. It's a nice story. And that's what they've been selling as the reason why it's safe for humans. It kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it by inserting a bacterial gene through the GMO process. And it doesn't harm humans at all because we don't have that pathway. This is the story we hear. Now, something that kills all plants, you need to be worried about that because many of the herbicides only kill some of the plants. They're specific to different classes of plants. But glyphosate is a universal plant killer, and it kills many microbes. And studies on the gut microbiome have shown that it preferentially kills the good guys. The bifidobacteria and the lactobacillus are much more sensitive to glyphosate than things like Clostridia and Pseudomonas. All these sort of nasty pathogens are like, yay, we've got a field day now because the good guys are getting killed off. There's room for us. We can grow. And you get this inflammatory gut situation because your immune cells are coming in there and trying to keep those pathogens in check. So then you get your inflammatory gut, you get your leaky gut barrier. And on top of that, glyphosate disrupts the proteins. I believe it's disrupting the proteins that break down proteins. So you have the enzymes, like the pancreatic enzymes, trypsin and pepsin. Well, there's actually trypsin, pepsin, and lipase. There are 3 pancreatic enzymes that Anthony Samsel ordered from a lab, a pig's version of these enzymes, which people can get to take as digestive enzymes when they're having digestive difficulties, which they're having because they're being poisoned by glyphosate. So people are taking these enzymes, and these enzymes have glyphosate in them. So you're basically fueling the fire when you do that, because the glyphosate levels in these enzymes were quite high that he tested. I think it's actually getting into the protein structure of those enzymes, but it's messing up their ability to do their job. And therefore, the proteins don't get digested. So when you have celiac disease, it's because the gluten is not an easy protein to break down anyway. But then you've got these cobbled digestive enzymes. So the gluten doesn't get broken down. You have the irritated gut, the barrier gets leaky, the undigested proteins get into the general circulation, and they cause autoimmune disease. And that's how you get to celiac disease, which is also linked to autism. Autistic kids have a higher rate of celiac disease. Many of them have gluten sensitivities. And so it begins in the gut, it begins with this disrupted gut. Once the gut barrier is leaky, then the brain barrier gets leaky as well. It sort of follows. And so now they've got the leaky brain. These undigested proteins can get into the brain and cause the brain's immune system to react. And then you start to get autoimmune disease in the brain. You get a sort of chronic low-grade inflammation in the brain that I think is associated with autism. That's almost a definition of autism, is to have this sort of low-grade inflammatory state, like an encephalopathy in the brain. And so that's sort of one whole piece of the story. Then there's other things like the metals are becoming deficient because glyphosate is binding to them. Glyphosate is a very good metal chelator. You get a manganese deficiency problem. I wrote a whole paper on manganese deficiency, which clearly has links to autism as well. And then you have, so that's the metals. You also have the disruption of the liver, because the liver has enzymes that liver is very important for detoxifying toxic chemicals. And the liver's detoxification system gets wrecked by glyphosate. So the liver becomes unable to deal properly with other chemicals that these kids are being exposed to, and you get synergistic toxicity. Everything else becomes more toxic because glyphosate's messing up the liver.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a huge, so, okay, yeah, okay, so we've got autism, and we know that autism is exponentially on the rise. You know, we talk about this, like everybody knows that by the year, you know, what is it, the year 2032, you know, 1 in 2 children
Yes.
born in that year will have,
Yes.
you know, by then we'll have autism, you know, we'll be.
If we continue at the current rate, yeah.
If we continue.
If the growth continues.
Yeah, which is insane.
And so far I feel like it is. You know, so I keep hoping it's going to slow down.
I don't see it slowing down at all. I haven't seen
I don't see it slowing down.
You know, they're still open, and that's what we're here to do, right? Is to slow that down or reverse it. Actually, is what we don't want to see this.
Right.
So we have autism. Okay, so glyphosate is very clearly you know, a causal factor for autism in the spectrum that we see. But also, what are some other diseases? Like you actually kind of touched on a few. Can you tell me, and I can probably guess with all this stuff that you're saying, if it affects the blood-brain barrier, the leak, you know, the gut barrier, you know, causing neural inflammation. But like, just give us a few that would actually could cause as well.
Right, and in fact, this is something I've had a lot of fun doing, and I've been collaborating with Nancy Swanson. She started this whole idea of looking at disease trends, and it's very fruitful. And she and I have published multiple papers together now. She published her first one before me, and she sent, you know, she contacted me, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing, because I wrote the first paper claiming that glyphosate could be linked to autism before I had seen the statistics, and which is kind of my fault that I didn't know that, because it would have been a perfect thing to put in that paper, that it's a perfect correlation. Autism perfectly correlates. When you look at first grade rates of autism and glyphosate usage over the previous 4 years, so from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life, the total glyphosate usage on cord crops, those two curves basically coincide. It's like a 0.997 correlation coefficient, which is just absolutely astonishing.
Wow.
You never see that kind of correlation. It's basically two curves lining up. And then there's all these other diseases. Sleep disorder is one that matches very well. We have a paper that talks about that. And of course, Alzheimer's is a really scary one. Dementia, that is rising dramatically, just like autism. You know, numbers are really scary. If you live to be 85 today in the United States, you've got a 50% chance of having Alzheimer's by the time you're 85. I'm not looking forward to that. You know, it's really scary. And then there's you know, Parkinson's disease and thyroid cancer, pancreatic cancer, bladder cancer. Let's see, of course, diabetes matches very well. Obesity, the obesity epidemic, I think it's a direct hit to the obesity epidemic. And depression, I think even the violent behavior, this is because of serotonin deficiency. So that, I didn't mention this before, but the shikimate pathway is very important to us, even though we don't have it in our cells. We rely on our gut microbes to use that pathway to produce the aromatic amino acids. And those are precursors to proteins. They're essential components of proteins. They're also precursors to all kinds of really important biologically active molecules, including all the neurotransmitters, the serotonin, the melatonin, the sleep hormone, melanin, melatonin and melanin, both of those. Yeah, melatonin, the sleep disorder, melanin, the skin tanning agent, a dopamine, thyroid hormone, all those things come out of that shikimate pathway. So they're all going to be messed up if your microbes are being poisoned by glyphosate. Yes. And I think that's also a key component of the diseases that are showing up, is the deficiencies in those crucial molecules.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess when we look at the body, like, you know, it's like these certain things that we need for health, like we need the microbiome to be healthy. And then we also need to have an intact, you know, gut barrier. We need to have an intact blood-brain barrier. So when those things are damaged by glyphosate, then you have these, like, all of these different things. You think, well, what's cancer got to do with autoimmunity? What's autoimmunity got to do with, you know, obesity? Like what does my microbiome have to do with the fact that I'm gaining weight, or that I can't think, or I have Alzheimer's? Like everything. Because when you understand that the importance of the microbiome, and again, you know, not and reactivity being such a huge, you know, proponent, like, or I guess a catalyst for disease because of the inflammatory cascade, it makes sense.
Yes,
It makes
exactly.
complete sense.
It totally does. Yeah, and it's interesting how when I actually did I just did a little study where I looked up the number of papers being published on the microbiome over
Yeah.
time in PubMed. You can just go to PubMed and you can just count, go this year, the next year, the next year, and count the number of papers. And that, of course, is also rising very dramatically in the past 2 decades in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. So you're seeing an increasing awareness of the importance of the microbiome as it's being increasingly poisoned by glyphosate. And we're getting a lot of great papers. People are learning, I mean, the computer scientists are learning how to do massive analyses of the genome, the microgenome, all of the genetic material of the microbes in the gut looked at collectively to see which proteins are being expressed. Really fascinating stuff. And they're finding all kinds of, they're looking for specific links between a certain distribution of the guts and the microbe and certain diseases. And they're finding that each disease signature has has some specific features. It's all very, very complicated, but you can see trends that certain bugs are flourishing in the gut of certain people who have certain diseases type of thing. And they're mapping, they're really becoming increasingly aware that in some sense, all disease begins in the gut.
Mm-hmm. I know, and it sounds so simple. I'm like, oh, that's just what people say. No, it's for real. Yeah. And so, okay, so let's get on to something like a little more techie, because since we've got you here, we're gonna like pick your brain and enjoy doing that. So I'm gonna actually read this question because so that I can keep my my brain, in the technical jargon, and then you're gonna explain this to us, please, in layman's terms. Okay, so
I'll try.
You believe that glyphosate has an insidious cumulative, like it adds on, builds up, toxic effect that is mediated by its acting as an amino acid analog. Okay, so an amino acid analog of the coding amino acid glycine. So it's a coding amino acid glycine. Okay, so can you explain that in layman's terms? I think it's
and it's really
important, but I think
I know it's
break it up.
It's super important, and I think many people haven't had an adequate biology background, which I'm surprised that they're not teaching this somewhere in the educational system because it's so basic in biology.
Yes.
The fact that proteins are built as beads on a string from the amino acids. They're like the building blocks of the proteins, and there's a DNA code in the genetics. The genetics of the genome, the DNA has sequences of these DNA molecules that hold the code. And so you have a 3-letter code that represents each of about 20 different amino acids. It's just sort of like looking up the code and writing down the answer. These proteins get built according to the code. And so there's a specific code. There's actually several codes that match glycine, GGA, GGC, GCT, and GGG. So all the different, there's 4 guys.
Okay.
As long as the first 2 are G, it's going to code for glycine. So you see that code, this machinery sees that code, it says, oh, I need a glycine residue here. It grabs the glycine, puts it in, and hooks it up to the paper dolls in the chain. But what happens is it sees glyphosate instead and thinks it's glycine because it is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine molecule, except that it has a little extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom. So the nitrogen atom is not fitting into the socket. The socket has to keep the nitrogen atom out into it's like putting a hand in the glove and the nitrogen atom is the arm. It's not in the glove. So the glove fits perfectly. You can put the glyphosate molecule into the glove, which is how it recognizes that it's glycine, the way the code works. And then that nitrogen atom is sticking out, ready to hook up. And it's got some things dangling off of it, but that's okay because it still matches.
Yeah.
This is how it gets tricked. So it goes into the protein, and it can't fit if it's crowded. So if the amino acids nearby are big, some of them are big, some of them are small, it won't fit. But if you've got a couple of little guys next to you, especially if you've got GGG, 3 glycines in a row, there's plenty of room for that extra material that's sticking on that nitrogen atom to fit into the structure. And so, so there are certain situations where there are certain glycines that have a lot of room around them in proteins where those glycines are absolutely essential for that protein to work properly. And you can go rummage through the research literature to find out exactly that situation, which I've done. So you can end up with a set of proteins that you would suspect, theoretically, would be susceptible to glyphosate damage. And when you do that, it lines up beautifully with all those diseases. It's quite an amazing story that emerges from that process.
So what happens? Okay, so what's happening there? Like, is there damage being created to the DNA or to so that protein by the glyphosate being present rather than glycine? Or do we see things like, you know, that you would see if you have a glycine deficiency because the glycine isn't able to, you know, go into that glove or be, you know, it's like those receptor sites are being taken up by glyphosate, right? Like what's happening, or both?
Yeah, you kind of got it right. So there's the DNA is fine. It doesn't disturb the DNA at all.
Okay.
The code is perfectly fine.
Yeah.
It's just that it understands the code. It doesn't disturb the DNA. I mean, it actually does disturb DNA, but that's a different story. But it sees the DNA code and then it puts the thing in, but it picks up the wrong ball, so to speak. It picks up the red ball instead of the green ball, and it puts that in to the protein. And once it does that, the protein behaves very, very differently from the way it would have behaved with glycine there, because glyphosate and glycine turn out to be very, very different because of that extra stuff that's on the nitrogen atom. Yeah. Glyphosate is bulkier, for one thing. It's got stuff there that needs to fit somewhere. And it's also negatively charged, which really it can really mess things up with certain proteins which don't want negative charge at that particular spot, or it's not going to work the way it needs to do its job. And the really good example that I've been zeroing in on is proteins that bind phosphate. And this is actually the case for the protein in the shikimate pathway that glyphosate disrupts. I was able to learn a lot about this process of glyphosate substitution by reading the research literature on the mechanisms by which glyphosate disrupts that protein in the shikimate pathway. That was very fruitful. And this includes papers by Monsanto researchers that were very, very helpful for explaining how this is happening. Only, of course, they didn't say that. They didn't say it was substituting for glycine. But it sure looks like they knew, because in fact, there's an amazing paper that's only recently published by Dow DuPont researchers, Dow and DuPont together. And that paper is quite scary because it's a paper about using CRISPR technology. I don't know if you've heard of CRISPR, but that's this new fancy technology that allows you to actually tweak the DNA, change the DNA of an organism, so as to change the protein. So this is great because they could take this, the way the GMOs work in the GMO crops is they insert a completely new gene for the enzyme in the shikimate pathway that's messed up. So the plant has this enzyme, but it's messed up, it's not working, you know, and then you put in this bacterial gene, you add it to the plant. So it has this other version of the enzyme that is completely insensitive to glyphosate. And the way that other version is insensitive is because it got rid of a glycine residue at a particular spot. So they know that the place where glyphosate messes things up is a place where phosphate binds. Phosphate attached to something called PEP. So the phosphate is trying to fit inside a socket that the protein has created. And that socket contains a glycine residue that's absolutely essential for it to work. Yeah. Only these bacteria came up with a solution that involved some tweaking around the site so that you could get by with alanine instead of glycine. Alanine has an extra methyl group. That's kind of a small little extra thing which will mess up the protein. But then you can readjust it on the other side. You can tweak it, you know, which is what the microbes have done. So they don't have glycine. The microbes that are resistant to glyphosate don't have glycine at that spot. And in fact, these guys, these Dow DuPont guys, the first thing they did was to tweak that enzyme so that glycine disappeared. They took away the glycine, replaced it with alanine, because they were using the model of these plants that were resistant to glyphosate. They said, if we get rid of this glycine, and they've learned this, in any situation, if you get rid of that glycine at that spot, the protein is no longer sensitive to glyphosate at all. It completely removes its sensitivity. So it really says that glycine is super, super important in terms of glyphosate toxicity. Something about that glycine is making it toxic. So it's really cool. And this is my insight that I got really only recently. And I've been studying glyphosate for 5 or 6 years. So it's kind of surprising it took me this long to figure this out. But the proteins that bind phosphate, they have a specific pattern that they work around that phosphate to make that shape work. Number one, they have to have room. So they need the glycine, which is it's the smallest amino acid. So they want something small. So there's room for that phosphate to fit. And they want to have nearby some positively charged amino acids that will attract the phosphate, which is negatively charged, just like a magnet, right? It'll bind like a magnet to the phosphate and hold it, secure it into place. So the protein is designed to fit a shape for phosphate, and with support by having these magnets that will pull the phosphate in. So that turns out to be absolutely perfect for glyphosate, because glyphosate has a methylphosphonyl group attached to it that is really, really similar to a phosphate. It has a negative charge. It has about the right size. It's going to fit perfectly into the place where the phosphate's supposed to go. And it's going to be wanting to go there because of the support from these positively charged amino acids that are nearby. So it's really a beautiful demonic system for causing glyphosate to go into proteins specifically when they are proteins that want to be able to bind phosphate. And it turns out to be a large number of extremely important and interesting proteins that bind phosphate, that have the glycine there, and that have those positively charged amino acids. It's a pattern that's been written about, that this is what you see in proteins that bind phosphate. And then these proteins get messed up because the glyphosate gets in the way of the phosphate can't bind, and now the protein can't work.
Okay.
It's really interesting. It's maybe hard to understand, but I hope I explained that enough for people to kind of get it.
I'm going to ask you questions like a dummy. Okay. Okay. So we're not looking at like a glycine deficiency, like I was kind of thinking, because it's not that what it's affecting is actually the phosphate. So it's phosphate.
Well, so because the, and of course it can be substituted elsewhere as well, but I think those proteins are especially susceptible because it almost just glyphosate just really wants to go in there. So even if glycine's lying around, the glyphosate is going to kind of shove itself in because it sees that opportunity to be attracted to that magnet. It just goes right in, so it'll get in the way even if there's glycine around. But it is true that a glycine deficiency will definitely probably make things worse. If you have a lot of glyphosate and not very much glycine, it's more likely to get the glyphosate into the protein. So I think you can actually eat foods that are rich in glycine or take glycine supplements might help to ameliorate the problem and make it happen less often.
Yeah. And glycine is important. Why? I mean,
oh gosh,
phosphate, but like, isn't it part of glycine also made
collagen?
Yeah.
Oh, and it's also, it's a lot of things. It provides methyl groups, for example, and we have a methylation deficiency problem with autism and also other people as well.
Yes.
Glycine is a source of methyl groups. Glycine, as I said, is the smallest amino acid. It's extremely highly popular in collagen. Collagen is the tissue protein. It's the most common protein by far in the body. 25% of the body's proteins are collagen molecules. And collagen has 20 to 25% of collagen molecules are glycines. So collagen has a huge amount of glycine. And so in fact, drinking bone broth, I rarely recommend drinking bone broth.
Yeah.
But it has to be organic, grass-fed, it has to be super healthy,
Yep.
Because it has minerals as well as having the collagen, the glycine.
And then what about phosphate? Okay, so we don't have this phosphate working properly. What's going on there downstream?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. For example, myosin. Myosin is a contractile protein in muscles. It's also really important in the gut for peristalsis. It causes the gut to contract and get feces to move. So myosin has, I think, 11 to 14 highly conserved glycine residues. And I know of at least 2 of them that have been shown experimentally that when somebody has a genetic mutation where it loses one of those glycines, it's dead in the water. It only contracts at 1% capacity. And you just change the glycine to alanine, which is the smallest change you can do, and it's dead in the water. So one of those glycines, and possibly both of those 2 glycines, but at least one of them is at a phosphate binding site. And it's a phosphate that's attached to an ATP molecule. So ATP, you may have heard of ATP, energy, right? Source of energy. Myosin uses ATP to move. That's the energy source that it uses to be able to make contraction happen. And it actually binds to, I think it binds to more than one ATP molecule, if I remember correctly. But anyway, this one ATP molecule, the site where the glycine is, the glycine gets substituted by glyphosate, it's going to completely kill it. It won't be able to contract. And because it can't bind to the ATP, so it can't use the ATP to generate energy, and which is pretty devastating. And so I think glyphosate is poisoning the gut in such a way as to paralyze it. And in fact, there was an interesting study on a woman who tried to commit suicide by drinking a glyphosate-based formulation, and it paralyzed her gut. They saw that it paralyzed her gut, which is like really good evidence that it might be doing that, And kids with autism have a lot of issues with constipation, which I think is due to basically a partially paralyzed gut.
Oh yeah. And I mean, you wouldn't believe, Stephanie, like the kids that I see, I like with GI distress, like even if they're not diagnosed with autism, not diagnosed with celiac just yet, or, having just like food reactivity, like problems, like so many kids have GI problems, and that it's not, and stuff's not moving, and it's, if there's dysbiosis, leaky gut too, but that not like things just not moving through, that is so common. Like it's so common. And Yeah, and I'm finding it harder and harder to fix.
Right, because there's more and more glyphosate. I think all these conditions are just going up. People are getting, more and more people are also getting aches and pains. And we see the epidemic in opioid drug, the opioid drug crisis.
Yeah.
Many people have tremendous back pain. They're taking opioid drugs just to try to be able to survive the pain. They're in agony, right? And they get hooked on the opioid drugs and then they kill themselves with an overdose. This is happening as an epidemic,
Yeah.
especially in the last few years. I think everything is coming to a head. I think all of these things that are slowly building up because glyphosate accumulates, and we're accumulating more and more every year because there's more in the environment every year. Every year we get more, and it doesn't necessarily go away either. Monsanto claims it disappears in 2 weeks, which is a lie. I mean, it may sometimes under optimal conditions, but it can stick around for a long time in certain soil types or aren't the microbes in the soil that are needed to break it down. It can stick around. It's pretty sturdy, and so it's accumulating. Every year we're getting more. First, you're adding more than we added last year. And we've got last year's supply still around. So we're getting more and more exposure and we're getting sicker and sicker. We're going to go into a huge crisis with the healthcare system. We already are, and we're struggling. How are we going to pay for healthcare? Our problem is that too many people are sick. Yeah. And many people have chronic diseases that cost a lot of money to take care of. Mm-hmm. The country's going to collapse under the burden of the healthcare costs in the coming years, I predict.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's just, you look and you see it coming on the horizon. And what you said about Monsanto's claim that it's gone in 2 weeks or whatever like that. I mean, it's in the food chain, so it's not gone. I mean, you eat them animals.
I know.
It's like, it's a perpetual cycle. It's in the food chain, even if it's gone from the soil, which it really kind of isn't, but then.
Which it isn't.
Animals that aren't, raised organic, they eat that and then you eat them. So, and then also, it doesn't matter if it's gone, even if it was gone in 2 weeks, the spraying is happening all the time. And it's always we're all being exposed. Who cares if it's gone like in 2 weeks? They're spraying again tomorrow.
I mean, it would be great if it were. It would be great if it were, but it isn't. And actually that's one thing I'd like to point out, because one way you can help to clear it, I believe, and I haven't, again, proven this. A lot of my stuff is theoretical, as you can see. I don't do experimental work. So I do a lot of reading, and then I synthesize ideas from the reading. I learned so there was a neat experiment. I have a paper on that on file, where they basically exposed a microbial community to glyphosate purposely in order to kill off everybody who can't survive it, and then to see who did survive it and to see if those species actually had a way to break it down. It's sort of smart to try to find out, are there species in this mix that can break it down? Yeah. And they found, when they did that, they found 2. And one of them was Acetobacter, which was like, I was so happy when I saw that. Mm-hmm. Acetobacter is a very interesting microbe because it's actually quite common in fermented foods, apple cider vinegar, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, really great foods today because they can clear the glyphosate, not just, bind to it and get it out through the feces, but actually get rid of it. It's a super, super thing that they can do. So I really encourage people to eat organic and to eat organic fermented foods. Really, really important to help their health, because you can get rid of the glyphosate in the oral cavity before you even hit the stomach, the mouth, the throat. Those microbes can get busy clearing the glyphosate that's in the food.
I love how you explain that, because I think that, when people say, we eat healthy, blah, 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 it's, if you'll feel better, blah, 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 it seems very benign and it seems so general. But then if you actually understand what you're doing, like if you're eating this kimchi, those, that's going to carry that glyphosate out of the body. Like it's like a cleansing. So when you're eating it, you're like, yes, like this is what's happening. So you can
not just carry it out, but get rid of it, break it down. That's really important. That's more than carrying it out. Because if you carry it out, it's in the feces. Now it's still on the earth, right? It didn't go away. But Acetobacter actually breaks it down and turns it into useful substances, like the phosphorus can be used as a source of phosphorus.
Wow.
So that is so, so super. And there's not many microbes that can do that, so it's a gift. It's a real gift that these microbes have.
It's an easy one. It's not hard to eat a little bit of kimchi on the side of a plate, once or twice a day.
Right, absolutely. And it's interesting how ancient cultures actually very commonly had this idea of eating fermented foods, not for glyphosate, because they didn't have glyphosate in those days, but I suspect in general, Acetobacter is probably a really healthy microbe to sort of have available when you're eating,
Wonderful. That gives me a lot of hope, actually, because let's do a little bit more of that, because we're getting near the end of our interview, which I'm sad to say. But okay, so besides that, like eating a strictly organic diet, I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? Like that's what we need to do.
Yes.
A strictly organic diet. And you're
Yes.
talking about adding, in some fermented foods or apple cider vinegar or something that has that particular bacteria in it that will break down and carry out the glyphosate out of the body and the earth itself. And then
Right.
things that can people do to heal the body from glyphosate poisoning, which is really what this is. Like we're being poisoned,
Yes.
albeit
We're
slowly,
being poisoned.
still a poisoning nonetheless. So
It's like eating arsenic. Yeah.
Yeah, a little at a
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Right. So I have a couple of other tips.
Yeah.
Sulfur, and I mentioned sulfur. You mentioned sulfur when you read my biography.
Yeah.
Sulfur is super, super important in the body, and glyphosate is an absolute train wreck for sulfur. And we didn't get into that, but I've got a lot of material on that available, and I'm working hard on that in that area. It's amazing. It's complicated chemistry, but it's basically it disrupts the ability of the microorganisms to turn inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur.
Mm-hmm.
And it also disrupts the ability to make sulfate. And sulfate is super, super important. It's important for the macrophages to be able to clear cellular debris. So when sulfate's deficient, and also it's important for detoxing in the liver. So when sulfate becomes deficient, all kinds of things get in trouble. In fact, the artistic brain has been shown to have low heparin sulfate in the ventricles. Inside the middle of the brain, you have those ventricle cavities where you have the cerebrospinal fluid. There's a deficiency in heparin sulfate there that I think is directly connected to the disruption of the distribution of sulfate by glyphosate. Mm-hmm. So sulfate deficiency, many kids, I think many autistic kids have sensitivities to sulfur because glyphosate is blocking the enzyme that makes the sulfate. And that means sulfite becomes toxic and they get hydrogen sulfide gas. So they get all kinds of issues in their gut because the sulfur is not able to be handled correctly. So if you switch to an organic diet, hopefully it might even reverse the sulfur sensitivity, but you need to be eating sulfur containing foods. I eat a lot of garlic, onions, cruciferous vegetables, seafood, grass-fed beef. These are all good sources. Eggs are great, very, very healthy, organic, very top of the line. Always buy top of the line foods. Eggs are a superfood because they have all kinds of nutritional value. So I like to eat highly nutritious food. Maybe it's sort of a paleo diet that I eat, but I don't, I eat wheat, I drink milk, I eat dairy. I mean, I don't drink that much milk, but I eat dairy. I eat a lot of fermented dairy, like I love sour cream and yogurt, so.
Yeah.
And cheese. Cheese I also very much enjoy, and cheese is a good source of sulfur. So, don't eat foods that are in a box. Eat the foods that you recognize what it is when you see it, and don't cook it very much. Lightly cook your vegetables because that cooking can destroy some of the nutritional value.
Yeah.
And then important is getting out in the sunlight. I really believe that the sunlight is very, very healing. And your body is able to use the energy in sunlight very, very well to produce important molecules, including sulfate. So I believe the skin synthesizes sulfate in response to sunlight. So getting out in the sun without sunscreen, without sunglasses, you can actually get sulfate into the eyes. Yes. You can get sulfate production in the pineal gland because you're getting sunlight exposure to the eyes. Don't wear sunglasses. Don't put sunglasses on your little kid.
Yeah.
And then I like Epsom salt baths, which is soaking in Epsom salt baths, which is magnesium sulfate. Magnesium is probably a deficiency problem as well, but I think the sulfate is equally important in magnesium sulfate. You can get both of those supplied in a way that bypasses the complications of the gut. So if your child's sensitive to sulfur, they might be able to handle magnesium sulfate baths.
Okay. Yeah, that was my question. Actually, I wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit because you said that a lot of children, and I've seen this as well, they're, sensitive to sulfate, and so, the advice is to not eat all those sulfur rich foods and stuff like that. So, right. So are they still eating that? Or or no? What do we do about that?
No, I think they cut them out. So they cut out the sulfur-containing foods, and then they get their sulfur deficiency problem just gets worse and worse.
Yeah.
And that just causes all kinds of disease, all kinds of things. And that's what's causing rheumatoid arthritis. I think it's probably causing cancer. I mean, Alzheimer's disease, all kinds of nasty things are coming out of that sulfur deficiency problem.
Yeah. Okay, so if they have a sensitivity, they still eat the sulfur, but they work on the other stuff to get rid of the sensitivity?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you deal with that. You have to get rid of, I'm hoping that if you ate the organic diet,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
would
yeah.
lose the sensitivity, because the sensitivity is due to glyphosate disrupting the enzyme. So you might hope that they would recover if you
Mhm.
could get rid of the glyphosate. And I don't know the answer to that. You could probably find
I
it
have
out
a
more easily than I
I
could,
have a,
because
I
you've
think,
got,
you know what I think? I think it would be a matter of a step by step, right? So first you
Mhm.
just switch over to the organic diet, la 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 la, and then you start, fixing the imbalances and toxicities. So I think
right.
that, well, the toxicity would be dealt with
Absolutely.
switching over, right? And then you deal with the
Mhm.
imbalances and the deficiencies. And yeah,
Yeah, and you don't want to go too fast, because you could get too many toxic chemicals swimming around in your blood that you can't
yep,
handle, because your system is impaired. I mean, as you improve your sulfate, you will improve your body's ability to detoxify, including removing glyphosate. So I think it's kind of a catch-22, because your sulfate system is shot to hell by glyphosate.
yep,
And if you had a sulfate-based system, you could clear it, but you don't, so you can't, and so you just end up piling up the glyphosate all over the place, which
yep.
is a really bad scene. But I think soaking in Epsom salt baths would be, if you know anybody who's sensitive to sulfur, I would love to know whether they are also sensitive to Epsom salt baths. They might be, but
Mhm.
I'm hoping they're not, because it's coming in through the skin rather than into the gut.
Yes,
You
yes,
know,
yeah.
it
No,
might be a better way to get the sulfur in.
yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking too. I think that's actually like very good. Plan. I think it would be a very good plan to do something like that, that sort of start with the glyphosate and move on and do stuff like the baths. Like I really like that. I think that would be really beneficial.
Mhm.
Okay, so final thoughts. Again, I want to keep you, but I can't.
Yeah.
So final
Yeah.
thoughts and where to like. I know your work is out there. Like there are a lot of papers if people really want to geek out with you, because I love doing
Mhm.
that. Not everybody does, but I love that. I mean, I think a lot of the parents listening would like that. So where can we find your papers, your research, your work? I guess we can just Google you, but do you have anywhere or any
Yeah, I mean,
what are you up to?
If you Google me, I think right at the top will be my MIT webpage. It's
Yeah.
not, it's a messy thing. It's like people.csale.mit.edu/Seneff. It's really geeky looking. It's all kinds of stuff on there, but I've got slideshows and papers and articles. I mean, all kinds of stuff on that webpage. That is a good place to start. And of
Okay.
course, you'll find all kinds of interviews like this one as well, that are available on YouTube and whatnot.
Yep.
Various interviews, and some presentations that I have that have been recorded and are available
Mm-hmm.
to watch, with slides. So there's all kinds of material, and you can sort of pick what kind of thing you find the easiest to absorb as far as getting started with that. Um, and the other thing I wanted to say is I think there are some things people can do if they're so inclined proactively. First of all, buying organic is important. That will also help the farmers be pressured to grow organic, which is what we need. We need the farmers to convert to organic.
Yep.
And also, if you are a politically active person, you can work hard on your in local politics to get your town aware of glyphosate and try to get it to ban glyphosate in public places. That's happening in cities around the country and around the world. They're
Mm-hmm.
one by one banning glyphosate usage in public places. And you need to worry about it. If your kids are on a playground, you want to make sure that playground is not being, glyphosate is not being used there. You need to find out who's responsible for that playground and make sure that nobody's using it there, that sort of thing. Just be aware of where your child's hanging out, or your neighbors.
Yep.
Are they using glyphosate on their lawns? Talk to them, make sure they're not, get them to understand why, that sort of thing. Just active locally to spread the word about the dangers of glyphosate would be very, very helpful. If we all do it, all of us who are in the know, spread the word, eventually everybody will know, and nobody will have an excuse to use glyphosate under any circumstance. It needs to be banned worldwide, and I hope I live long enough to see that happen.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope so too. And you're definitely doing your part to educate people. And I think that we can, all as parents can take up that torch and make changes within our own families and our own communities, our neighborhoods. And, it's inevitable if more people that find this out and can support each other and actually stop their own usage, it's just going to happen. So I
Yes.
share that goal with you. I hope that we do see that your lifetime, our children's lifetime. And I thank you so much for being part of the Children's Health Summit 4. And
Thank you.
appreciate you being here. And you have yourself a wonderful day.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this interview, and be sure to listen to more interviews from this timely and groundbreaking series. If you would like more information, guidance, and support through your family's health journey, and or want to join our growing community of professionally trained family health coaches, please visit us at healthyfamilyformula.com. Together, we can turn the tide for the future health of our children. May you and your families be well.